Well, welcome everybody again. Thank you so much for joining us today in this month's topic about fat, the complexities of fat, muscle, and insulin. My name is Cheri Stoka, and I am joined with Karen Kennedy, who is joining us as a guest today because we're going to dig into the different biomarkers of metabolic health. And Karen Kennedy is definitely the expert as it relates to insulin, blood sugars, and that type of thing. And then I'm going to dig more into body composition, fat, muscle. So hopefully you learn a lot during this, and you learn different practical ways to bring this to your patients so that you can optimize their metabolic health. Okay. All right, so just a little bit about me so you understand kind of my background and where my passion comes from. I opened Weighless MD in 2015. So Weighless MD is a medical weight loss and wellness clinic. And so we're very holistic in nature. However, we also incorporate medical treatments as well. So we believe that food is the foundation. Over the past 10 years, we have created our own programs to address many different facets of health and imbalances in the body to help people not only lose weight, but keep it off. So we consider ourselves experts in weight loss and metabolic health, and we absolutely are experts in GLP-1 medications as well, which I'll briefly touch on. I know there's a question right now. I don't know if we need to answer. Okay, nope, we're good to go. Okay, so Weighless MD again is my brick and mortar. I have several locations. About a year ago, Erica Gutierrez, who is also a functional nutritionist and registered dietitian, she worked for me for almost 9 years. And about a year ago, we decided to create Weighless RDs. And Weighless RDs is really a new entity that is really designed to bring dietitians and functional nutritionists together to reshape the future of weight management. We have been in this industry for so long, and we just see that there's really a disconnect as far as how we are treating patients who are obese and who have metabolic dysfunction. And we just really felt that by collaborating, we could all learn from each other and really create more of a succinct message to help people really overcome this obesity pandemic. Dietitians are critical for helping patients in weight loss. Obviously, functional nutritionists fall under that as well. And for so many years, we just were told that we just have to look at calories and we just have to get people to exercise more. And we know that, that no longer applies because of the state of health that most people are in nowadays. Weight loss is absolutely multifactorial. That's why we take a functional and integrative weight loss approach. And lastly, GLPs are the future, and whether you agree with it or not, it is essential that you become an expert in this area, just because the majority of people are on it right now, and more is going to be coming out in the future, and staying ahead of this is going to be crucial. So the objectives of this presentation is we're going to talk about metabolic health. We'll talk about, as I mentioned, the crucial and practical biomarkers that you can easily incorporate, into your practice. We'll talk a little bit about growing challenges in metabolic health, and then some practical strategies for ensuring optimal health. So I know this is a busy slide, but metabolic health is thrown out there all over the place. So really, just to kind of bring us all on the level playing field, metabolic health really just means how well your body processes and uses food for energy. But it's more than just, giving us energy to run and move. We need this energy for normal bodily functions, such as breathing, movement, thinking, temperature regulation, etc. But when it comes to, the markers that we look at related to metabolic health, these are the key ones. How are you able to control your blood sugar on your own? These are key things that drive metabolic health. Blood sugar, blood sugar control, blood pressure, cholesterol, triglycerides, your waist circumference. These areas are looked at on a regular basis when, in traditional medicine in our medical system. And we have gotten so far removed from really helping people address these issues in a more foundational and natural way. And now we are at a point where, we are able to check these different metrics, and people are handed medications, it just as as regular practice. So we don't think that if somebody has good blood sugar control, good blood pressure control, and good cholesterol, etc., and they're on multiple meds, we don't consider that good metabolic health. So it's just something to think about as you're working with patients. They might tell you, oh yeah, my blood pressure is fine, but they're on, 3 different blood pressure meds. So again, these are the key areas that really drive metabolic health, and we'll dig deeper into that. So this slide is really kind of, helping you think more about metabolic dysfunction and when it begins, because obesity is really the last case, scenario, the ultimate of metabolic dysfunction, but patients could have metabolic dysfunction earlier in life. Let's say when they were 130 pounds or 150 pounds, they were put on a medication for blood pressure. And then, 10 years later, now they're on a cholesterol medication. Now they're on, medications to control their blood sugars. So metabolic dysfunction starts very early in life. And again, because our system is so designed to just give a medication and not address the root problem, this is why we are in the situation that we're in. And our medical system, again, I won't kind of go down any rabbit holes with that. But if you think about it, all of the things that we're looking for on a regular basis, that we can check for, that we can draw labs for, blood pressure, cholesterol, blood sugar, if patients have reflux, they're given a med. We don't check insulin levels because we don't have a solution for it in the medical algorithm, right? So you have to start to think about that, and we're going to dig into a lot of, the importance of knowing, insulin levels and things like that. But I think, it's a little, it makes you question why, since it's so important to foundational health, why we are not regularly checking insulin levels. So the foundational biomarkers, insulin, blood sugars, body fat, and muscle mass are, again, foundational, and again, more practical ways that we can look into this, rather than, because we all know there's a million tests that we can do. And, at the end of the day, when you can look at a certain number of markers and keep it pretty simple, that's what we're always trying to do as we're, working with our patients. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to let Karen take over and talk a little bit about our first biomarkers here, insulin and blood sugars. So Karen, you can take it from here.
All right. Well, thanks, Cheri. Thanks, Erica. I'm really glad that you guys invited me. Cheri and Erica and I have collaborated on a few different things because I just appreciate so much of what you guys talk about and how you support your patients in weight loss, and have it be sort of metabolic health first focus on weight. And so what I want to add to this is a little bit about pushing back a little against the glucose-centric system, which is a different way of saying what Cheri just said. No one's testing insulin. No one's looking at insulin because there's not a medical treatment for it. And, we see that metabolic health has been, it's about measuring glucose. That's what they measure. And that's not always the best metric. They're looking at A1C, fasting glucose, or glucose tolerance tests, which used to be the standard, and now CGM. These are all important metrics that I want to be used with our patients every year, a couple of times a year. But we know that especially when it comes to weight health, insulin is the hormone we need to pay attention to. So just a quick review. This is just a little cartoon that I made. This
Karen,
axis. Yeah,
sorry, I don't, Erica, do you see her slides?
Yeah, I see her slides.
you see them?
You
Okay.
might
Oh,
have
interesting.
to
Okay.
stop sharing yours.
Pardon?
You might have to stop sharing yours.
Yes. Okay. Gotcha. Sorry. Go ahead.
That's all right. So, this x-axis is time, the y-axis is just the glucose levels. You see, like, and this is in US units, 70 mg per deciliter to 140 mg per deciliter is this little Goldilocks zone box I set. And this is an example of how when you wake up in the morning and you're at fasted levels, 85 mg per deciliter, and you eat and glucose rises and comes down. And we see that, if you're monitoring patients using a continuous glucose monitor or whatever, we'll see this. But in the background, what we're not seeing is the insulin. And in a healthy, metabolically healthy person, insulin starts off, it doesn't start off at a, kind of a baseline Goldilocks zone. It starts off on the ground. It's down near, 5. That's a healthy insulin level to start off with at 5. And then when glucose goes up, once we have food in our stomachs, hitting those incretins, going up, then we're going to have a rise in insulin, a transient, acute rise in insulin, and then insulin drops back down to baseline when it's no longer needed. And that's because insulin works. What insulin does is when that glucose goes up, we don't want glucose to be floating around up above, 180 mg per deciliter. We want, the body needs to skim off that excess and store it away for later. And so what insulin does is insulin comes in and it acts like a key to sock away that excess glucose into either fat or muscle cells, mostly. And that's storage, because insulin is an anabolic hormone. It tells your body to store energy, to store this glucose, eventually becomes fat, usually in these muscles, or glycogen, and it's storing for later. And then when insulin drops down later, that energy can be liberated and used. But, so it's a double bonus. One, you get the energy to use to do all the things later, which is great. And also you reduce that fat. So you maintain a pretty steady state fat storage. My slides are a little out of order. So I put this extra little slide in here, which is like a switch, a fat storage switch. In a very simplistic way, insulin is a fat storage switch. When insulin is elevated, it tells us to store the excess energy. And when insulin is down, it allows us to, burn fat. I'll use air quotes, burn fat, but, beta oxidation, move the fats into mitochondria and use it for energy. So that's why insulin is so important. And a transient rise in insulin is fine, is physiologically normal. But what we're concerned about is that rise of insulin, that gets high and stays higher, because while you might have a transient rise of insulin, it might go up to 20, it might go up to 50 with a meal and then come down. What's happening with people with metabolic impairment or metabolic syndrome, hyperinsulinemia, is their insulin could be going up, I don't know what they're going up to, 100, something a little bit more than that. But their fasting insulin levels, when you look at them, could be 15, they could be 25 easily. And that's too high. That's going to put them in a place where they can't make that metabolic switch. They can't be metabolically flexible and switch out of fat storage and into fat burning, which puts them in not only a low energy state, but in a constant state of fat storage, inability to use their fat stores. But insulin does so much more. And you probably all know this, so I'll just remind you, it does tell the body to store energy. It does inhibit lipolysis, which is breaking down that fat and move it out to the mitochondria, and it inhibits the beta oxidation, which is moving that through the mitochondria. And insulin inhibits gluconeogenesis in the liver until the liver is insulin resistant. And then a low or normal insulin levels, they allow for the lipolysis and beta oxidation, and they allow for gluconeogenesis in the liver. So there's a balance there. And they've even shown, you might have heard, high insulin levels causes fatty liver, fat to be stored in the liver. And that's when you have chronically elevated insulin. That's not from the acute insulin. So I want you to remember that acute rises in insulin are good, physiologically normal, and help you maintain your energy stores and maintain glucose regulation. But it's those chronic elevated insulin levels that are the problem. And what's important to remember is we don't see this high insulin. And sometimes the hyperinsulinemia, the chronically elevated insulin, can make glucose labs look fine for a very long time. And I'll show you a little bit more about this later. Because basically when you have hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, and they do go together usually because hyperinsulinemia causes insulin resistance. Then when you need to store away excess energy in a fat or muscle cell, you can do it. You can get that glucose stored away in good time, but it can take 2, 3, 4, 5 times as much insulin to do that. The analogy I always think in my head these days is when Harry Potter received his invitation to go to Hogwarts. I don't know if you are a Harry Potter fan. And the first invitation he received, he gets, Owl posts, and Owl posts an invitation through the letterbox of his crazy aunt and uncle. And it goes in, but pretty soon they're taping up the letterbox and sealing up the flue of the chimney. And now it's taking thousands of owls just to get one invitation into Harry Potter. And so that's hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. We're not going to touch on these, but I do kind of want to remind you, there are other causes of insulin resistance. And these are usually transient. Usually these are things where it will cause a transient insulin resistance that will then go away once the cause is gone. So stress, acute stress, chronic stress, this causes insulin resistance. Poor sleep, because poor sleep raises cortisol, which then basically creates a stress situation. But poor sleep one night, you'll be insulin resistant the next day until you get a better night's sleep. If you have inflammation, if you have the flu, you watch your patients when they are, if they're using a continuous glucose monitor. I know during the COVID pandemic, I had lots of groups going and people getting COVID right and left, and perfectly reasonable blood sugar levels. And then all of a sudden, all their blood sugar is just sitting right up at 180, pegged it there 24/7. And that's normal. That is normal. It's unfortunate, but that's what happens. I'm gonna blast through this. I changed the order of my slides. So if you're using a continuous glucose monitor, so I use continuous glucose monitors in all my patients. And I like using them because, of course, insulin follows glucose. Insulin follows glucose. But I want to say there's a big limitation in using a continuous glucose monitor with your patients when they have hyperinsulinemia. And most people who are obese, who are storing a lot of excess fat, if they aren't on insulin, you will find they have hyperinsulinemia. And if they do, then their glucose numbers might be skewed. And I'll show you a picture of that later. But I find by using a continuous glucose monitor, at least it gives me a chance to see what they're eating and how it's affecting their glucose. And it gives my patient some agency, and they can actually see, well, what is working? And they can use metrics like, keeping their blood sugar flat overnight to make sure they're, in a fasted state overnight. I can tell them I want them to stay in range most of the time, and we can be specific about what most of the time means and be specific about what their target range should be, because it is going to be different for different populations. but let's say it's 70 to 140. This is an example of someone who's staying in range most of the time and just went up a little bit. But that's another metric that we can use to help them manage their insulin levels by managing glucose. And then asking them to come back to baseline between meals. Of course, we can't ask somebody, be sure you come back to baseline between meals, because sometimes it just doesn't happen. But it's a way of they're looking at their meals a little differently, saying, that meal like kept my blood sugar up for like 4 hours after eating. Maybe I need to rethink that meal a little bit and tweak it. So this is the kind of thing that gives them a tool to be using to assess all of their own meals in the wild. Because of course we know if glucose is staying elevated for 4 hours, I don't even know how long insulin's going to be staying up. But I know that if it, the earlier glucose comes down, then the earlier insulin's going to come down. But here's the caution, and I've learned this after years of watching people on continuous glucose monitors. If you have a patient who clearly has hyperinsulinemia, and you track them, you track their blood sugar, oftentimes it will look like they don't have a problem with carbohydrates. So this is actual data from a patient who was in one of my group programs, and she was obese. She had obesity, and had hyperinsulinemia, like as evidenced by she had a waist circumference of over 45 inches. Her triglyceride levels were about 200 mg per deciliter, and so I was pretty sure that she had a robust insulin response. But when she had meals like this, where there were significant amount of carbohydrates in them, and her blood sugar barely budged, I thought, oh. And she thought, I can actually have a sandwich. This is like, I don't think it's in here, but this is a person who I remember having a sandwich, 2 slices of bread, just a turkey sandwich, and like an orange, and it barely budged her blood sugar. That's a lot of carbohydrates. It should have gone up. To anybody else, it would have gone up to like 160, even 180, and then come back down. I would have considered that normal, maybe even 200. But it barely went up to 140. And she's like, well, I think a sandwich is probably a good meal for me. And I said, I think a continuous glucose monitor is a terrible metric for you. Yeah. And so that's where I learned that the hard way. So remember this for yourself. If you know you have a patient with hyperinsulinemia, a CGM won't be telling the whole picture. Or if they are using a CGM, they need a tighter range. Yeah, they need a tighter range. But the good news is that simple improvements in blood sugar also lower insulin, because sometimes you have to infer. We don't have yet a continuous insulin monitor. That will be on the top of my Christmas list once we get that. An interesting paper I just looked at last week, and I just added this recently, so this is a surprise to Cheri and Erica, was just talking about the order of eating. So you might have heard that people will use the order of eating to manage glucose, meaning they'll have like protein and fibrous vegetables first in a meal and carbohydrates last. And we've seen this over and over on continuous glucose monitor data, that it flattens the curve. Steak, salad, baked potato. If you eat the baked potato first, blood sugar goes really high. But if you eat the baked potato last, you get more of a rolling hill. Anyways, this order of eating in non-diabetic individuals, this looks at blood glucose and it lowers the area under the curve that you can see here. But interestingly, this is why I looked at it, it also changes the insulin response. So the orange is the VPF, is vegetable protein first. You can see that it had a much lower even insulin response here that didn't go up nearly as high. And this is the area under the curve was lower for insulin. So these are small changes. Like if they just do the order of eating, things will get better. They'll get better slowly. There are much more powerful levers to improve insulin sensitivity, to bring insulin levels down. But I wanted to bring this up because so often we're working with people and we just need a couple of easy things for them to do. And this is one, is the order of eating. And that insulin patterns do follow glucose patterns, but you can't hang your hat on the glucose when insulin levels are high. So, finishing up, I want to talk about, just reiterate what Cheri said about better insulin metrics. And fasting insulin, this is an easy one, and I'm going to show you the prices for this. Triglycerides, it's a great metric for insulin, but know that people of African descent, that's an exception. If you get someone of African descent, their triglycerides may not become elevated when they have higher insulin levels. So just don't count on that with them. Waist circumference, of course, visceral adipose tissue, and often inflammation markers and ALT, liver. That's less reliable, but you can watch that. This is there are lots of great metrics, but sometimes you all know that there's people who aren't going to go get a body composition done. They're not going to go and get their insulin levels tested. They're not going to get a CGM. You need something easy. And one of my easy things is just using a spreadsheet to track weekly waist. And then, in your spreadsheet, you can just do a little analysis, and it makes a little graph for you that you can, share with your patient every time you meet with them. And so this is someone who I recently started working with, is just doing the easy things, because her fasting insulin is about 25, and she's just steadily, her waist is going down. Gosh, she's so happy about that. I don't think she cares about her blood sugar, but she's so damn happy about her waist. I would be too. So this is an easy, free metric that you can use, which is very responsive to insulin. And basically, it's a reflection of visceral adipose tissue. That's what you're thinking, and that Cheri's going to talk more about that afterwards. I would love to give everybody an InBody or DEXA, but that isn't always realistic. But I do want to encourage you to order your own labs. Relying on doctors to order what you want is a fool's errand. I have tried it repeatedly many times. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's crickets on their end. And so I find it's much easier to use Fullscript, Evexia, or Rupa, all of which you can have an account on and order labs if you're not already. Very transparent pricing. I know their insurance won't cover it, but it is so inexpensive. And so I just I created this panel on Fullscript. Nothing crazy here, just really basic metrics. I know this is small, but you can see that a fasting insulin is $6.60. $6.60. And then I think the lab fee is $10. So even if they just get a fasting insulin done, they're in and out of there in like 17 bucks. Really easy. And so while they're in there, you might as well get a full iron panel done, because half your patients aren't getting their iron levels checked. But this is super simple on Fullscript. They go through Quest. Evexia goes through LabCorp. So you can always check what lab do you usually go to, and you can see from usually the labs they already have. And that is where I'm going to stop. I want to give some time for Cheri to finish this up. But really, I was really hoping that I could just impress upon you how important it is not only to use these correct metrics, but also, tracking the right metric for your patients also gives them feedback. I find that when you get someone with hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, they're going to have an elevated fasting blood sugar that initially you can get that down a little bit, but it actually stays high for a long time, and it can be hard to come down. But in the background, you can be dropping their fasting insulin down. And if you're getting that checked semi-regularly and checking their waist weekly, it gives them a sense of, I'm on the right track, I'm on the right track. And that is so great, because people hate to think that they're not progressing. They lose faith in the process. And so, every 3 months getting an insulin to say, oh my gosh, your insulin level's coming down. And to say your waist has dropped another ½ inch this week, you're on the right track, you're doing great. These simple things can make a big difference to your patients.
Okay, I will take it from here. And everybody can see my slides, Erica? Everything look okay?
Looks good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I am gonna talk a little bit about the body composition. It's funny because Karen, you just kind of said about the importance of it, and it's not always possible for people. And I'm kind of the one person that says, if you are helping people lose weight and not knowing about the body composition, it's going to be really hard to really know how you're changing their metabolic health. But essentially, the body is made up of 4 main components. We have intracellular water, extracellular water, dry lean mass, which is bone and muscle, and then we have our body fat mass, which is the subcutaneous and the visceral. So those four things make up the body composition. I'm going to dig deeper into muscle and fat. And so I think I always like to bring just different ways of looking at things. So when you think about the human body, and when when we are in a time of need or time of need of food or energy, our body is equipped to provide that for a period of time. So you can see that we have different storage sites in our body. Obviously, blood glucose is a way for us to use that for energy. We store sugar in our liver. We store sugar in our muscle. And then we have fats in our muscle. And then we have our fat cells. And then we have muscle protein. So you can kind of see the approximate energy in kcals in each storage site. So this is really important as we go through these slides. But just to put this in a practical sense, so when you are you need energy, maybe you're going for a run and you have like some type of workout class, your body's going to use the sugar in the blood, or it's going to go to liver glycogen. Liver glycogen it stores sugar for a short period of time, provides about 400 calories. Then it will go to muscle glycogen, which will provide about 1,200 to 2,000 calories. Again, these are estimations. And then what is supposed to happen is when you are in need of energy, the next place to go is fat. That is what the fat cells, the adipose tissue is for. And as you can see, the energy source of fat can be endless, really depending on how much fat you have. So in this particular breakdown here, you see adipose tissue can provide 80,000 plus calories when you need it. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I'll go to the slides and I'll circle back because it never made sense to me because all we're hearing about now in this, especially with the GLP world, it's like muscle mass loss. The body is losing so much muscle, skeletal lean muscle mass. So I'm really going to help kind of break this down and help you look at this as you're working with your patients. But essentially, we're taught in dietitian school that there's approximately 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. So we do the in-body, we are measuring muscle, fat, lean body tissue all the time. The value that it brings for us, it really is truly remarkable, especially when you can see kind of things move. But for this particular person, body fat mass in pounds, they have 101.9 pounds of body fat. So technically that would be over 400,000 calories stored in their body that they have for use if needed. So again, why are we seeing all of this muscle mass loss when the majority of people have more than adequate amounts of adipose tissue to use for energy? Okay, I thought this slide was a little bit later, but I will just mention this because insulin being obviously the master hormone, what's important to kind of understand too is that there's insulin receptors all over our body. This is not just about the fat tissue or the muscles. It's in our liver, in our brain, in our kidneys. So insulin resistance starts in one place. Some people argue that it starts in the muscle. One fat cell scientist who's been studying fat cells forever believes absolutely that it starts in the fat cell. But the whole point of this is, again, to realize that insulin resistance starts somewhere and then it starts affecting the entire body. So that's when you start to see, the liver issues, the fatty liver, you start to see kidneys, kidney disease and that type of thing because of these, blood sugar dysregulations. So it's kind of like a chain reaction, but so insulin is kind of the driver of all that destruction. So I just mentioned that our body has a lot of adipose tissue to be used for energy when we need it. But now this is where we're going to get into the differentiation and help you understand like why now the body is going to some muscle before it goes to some fat. So the fat, all fat is not the same. And this is going to be a very general, explanation of the fat cells, but we definitely offer more education and getting deeper into the fat cells. But we, for the most part, we have two main fat cells. We have white fat and we have brown fat. So white fat is a white cell that has a large lipid droplet. You can see here, it's designed to store energy. It has few mitochondria, and it is usually found in kind of like the visceral area. So for most of you, most people probably know that all fat cells have to be moved to the mitochondria to be used for energy. So anytime, we're talking about beta oxidation, lipolysis and things like that, like mitochondria plays such a huge role in that. So a brown fat cell actually makes you healthier, and it actually helps your body burn more fat. So you can just see, obviously, it's a very simplistic view of what a brown fat cell looks like with multiple mitochondria and smaller droplets. So to further just explain the fat cell differences, so visceral, which Karen talked about, this is the deeper fat that is within the abdominal cavity. So it literally lines all of the vital organs, your intestines, your gallbladder, your stomach, all the internal organs there. The subcutaneous fat, which is the pinchable fat, that is going to be fat that it's not as damaging. It doesn't affect your metabolic health as much. But to kind of stick to like this wordy slide, subcutaneous fat, again, the pinchable, these are smaller fat cells. They're greater, there's greater in quantity of fat cells, and they're less metabolically active. Visceral fat, they are very metabolically active. They're more insulin resistant. They have a higher filtration of immune cells within the fat cells, and they kind of act as it's their own endocrine organ, meaning that visceral fat can actually create its own fat cells from the excess sugar floating around. So it's pretty destructive as an organ, and you can just kind of see here, this is an image that Erica actually put together for us to explain to our patients. But visceral fat causes systemic inflammation, it increases insulin resistance, and it signals hormone, hunger and stress hormones. So it disrupts the entire body. And again, if you're interested in learning more and going deeper into this, we're going to talk about options at the end. So visceral fat, when you are in need of energy, let's say, it can be anything. You've exercised for a while, you went on a lower calorie diet, and your body's like, okay, I've used all the energy sources coming in as food, so now I need to look where to access this energy. Why is it going to muscle so quickly? So the reason for that is because of the visceral fat. The visceral fat, despite what I still see in, when you go Google certain things, it says visceral fat is the first to go when someone is on a diet. That is absolutely not true. Visceral fat is very, very resistant, and these are some of the reasons why. So visceral fat cells have fewer beta adrenergic receptors that are crucial for fat breakdown. They release more inflammatory compounds that inhibit fat mobilization. Again, you have to mobilize fats into the mitochondria, so that does not happen. The cells don't respond to insulin, so now, like Karen mentioned, you're more in that fat storing mode versus fat burning mode because of insulin dysregulation, blood sugar dysregulation. And but in addition to all of those things going on, that is a stress on the body. Visceral fat, an elevated level of visceral fat, is a stress on the body. And a stress situation increases cortisol, and now cortisol is even adding more to this fat accumulation in the body. So over time, visceral fat cells become it they just keep getting larger and larger because they don't multiply. And I'll explain that in the next slide. But essentially a fat cell will just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And when it can't go any larger, it starts to spill over. And because of the visceral fat being in the area that it is, and the portal vein that goes kind of straight to the liver, all of that excess fat goes straight into the liver. So that's why we're seeing such a high incidence of fatty liver nowadays, even in younger kids. And it's literally because of these visceral fat, these large fat cells that are just getting too much and you can't handle it anymore. And then there's definitely more to it because the fat cells eventually become hypoxic as well. So that kind of creates another whole host of things that happen just due to all of the visceral fat cells. So fat cells change over time. And again, this is just a kind of a brief summary, but it's very interesting when you start to like dig deeper into it. But essentially, we're born with, we lay down a bunch of different fat cells, and fat cells, we will continue to expand, or it's called hyperplasia, so it will grow in number. And that's very, very normal. So at about age 60, the fat cells will begin to stabilize. So it's not common to start to create more fat cells. What will start to happen is the fat cells that you have will just continue to get larger. I'm not saying that you can't grow more fat cells, because you absolutely can, and there are things that actually can do that. But for the most part, the cells just start to get larger and more insulin resistant and inflammatory and that type of thing. Women have more fat cells than men, which is obviously for reasons and in certain areas, just so, carrying babies and things like that. But in premenopause, things change for women. And yeah, there's definitely like hormonal changes for sure. But what happens is around age 60, remember, you're no longer creating more fat cells. So now the fat cells that you have become more estrogenic, and they become more insulin resistant. So when women in premenopause stage gain weight, now it's mainly in that visceral. You're not getting it like around your hips, where you did when you were younger. Now it's changing because of the change in the fat cell. Insulin-resistant fat cells can convert glucose to fat on a regular basis. And so, this is where the frustration happens, because if you're not addressing the root problem, which is insulin resistance, people will continue to gain fat even when they're on diets and trying to eat healthier, because the body's still using all of the available glucose and gluconeogenesis and things like that. So it's kind of this whole vicious cycle that all can really be addressed if we just get to the root, which obviously is more of the insulin resistance and the visceral fat. All right, now we're going to dig into muscle. And again, I don't know about you guys, but all I hear about is how much muscle people lose when they're on a weight loss program. So this is why I really wanted to kind of just look at things in a different way. All right, so muscle tissue is the main site for glucose disposal and insulin sensitivity. So anytime your body needs to get rid of glucose, the muscle is happy to take it up. So it's very readily transported into the muscle. Higher muscle mass is generally associated with improved insulin sensitivity. So I think most people kind of understand that. That's not a big surprise. What's interesting is that, you wouldn't know this unless you're doing like body composition analysis on a regular basis, but most obese people have very, very, very high muscle mass levels. And so this is where this is what really triggered me to look deeper into it because I don't know, it just didn't make sense for so long. But anyway, so what we need to factor when you're looking at a lean person's muscle mass versus a obese person's muscle mass, the quality of the muscle mass is very, very different. So muscle mass in an obese person has this intramyocellular lipid accumulation. So there's excess fat within the muscle cells that's going to obviously interfere with the muscle, the muscle strength, contraction, that type of thing. The muscle has fewer mitochondria. The inflammation just in general, because obesity is a low, you're in that constant state of low-grade inflammation. So that's going to have an effect on the ability of the muscle to perform the way that it's supposed to. There are some neural adaptations that the body begins to experience when it's in kind of this dysfunctional state. And then the muscle also has alterations in the muscle fiber type. So there's type 2 and type 1. And in an obese muscle mass structure, they tend to have more of these type 2 muscle fibers that are less efficient at using oxygen and are associated with lower insulin sensitivity. And then they also, these types of muscle structures have impaired muscle protein turnover. So yes, an obese person may have more muscle mass, but you have to consider the quality of the muscle mass. And this is the example that I wanted to show you because this is a patient that I've been working with for a while. And we literally I was just reviewing everything with him. And then I just remembered like this would be such a great example to share today. But okay, so this particular man, you can see, hopefully you can see this, but he started with us at a weight of 377 and he's been working with us for a long time, so 5 years. His current weight is 221. His visceral fat was 30. It could have been way more. There were changes in our the in-body updated algorithm where it could have been a lot higher, but that was the max. But now his visceral is down to 14. A 10 on our scale, on our in-body 570, a 10 or less is considered a healthy range. So you can see like drastic improvement. His body fat mass when he was 377 was 197 pounds of his weight was just fat, and now it's 72 pounds. And his muscle mass when he was 377 pounds was 103 pounds of it was muscle. So now it's 84 pounds of muscle. So when you look at that, you would think, wow, that's a lot of muscle mass loss. So that's why you have to consider many different things, because the first important point is that muscle protein and fat within the muscle is very different. So muscle protein is never supposed to be used for energy. Okay, so if you go back to that one slide, I think muscle protein, it was a lot. It was like 30,000 calories, but muscle is designed to repair, regenerate, and things like that. So again, the muscle within the fat can be used. Muscle mass loss in an obese person can be normal if the muscle quality is being factored in, because most studies and most body composition scales are not differentiating the quality of the muscle mass loss. So if I looked at this guy and I'm like, oh wow, like this is not good. We're putting him in a worse metabolic state. But again, with knowing the full body comp, if you look at his skeletal muscle mass here, this down arrow is below normal range. This is the normal range here, and he's still well above that normal range. So again, it's kind of looking at the full picture, not just assuming that, oh my gosh, he's wasting away from muscle and he's in a worse metabolic state. You have to look at the full picture, and you certainly have to really analyze and understand, not that you're going to be looking at the structure of the muscle, but understand that just because there might be some muscle mass loss, it could be all of the bad stuff that's infiltrated, and he could be just improving his muscle mass along the way. The other important thing is that muscle mass. So there's muscle fat and other things that is in muscle, and then you have the actual muscle protein. So muscle protein is never supposed to be used when the body needs it, because we should, again, always have we should have enough fat. But now, because of the visceral fat, if somebody has a high amount of visceral fat, that is no longer recognized to be used for energy because of its state, because of its inflammatory and resistant state. So it's almost like when your body needs energy, it's thinking it's in a starved state because it doesn't even recognize the majority of that visceral fat. So hopefully that made sense. I'm not going to go into these slides in detail by any means, because I know they're busy, but I did want to talk a little bit about the GLPs and muscle loss, because again, that's another hot thing that is kind of circulating around the media and that type of thing. But essentially, the studies are kind of all over the place. But again, it has to do with how the study is actually designed, and looking at, certain quality versus, quantity and muscle mass and that type of thing. But essentially, I think most people know that when you lose weight, anytime you lose weight, if you're not eating enough protein, if you're not exercising and doing certain things, there's going to be muscle mass loss. Again, we don't know what kind, but there's going to be muscle mass loss no matter what. So GLP or not, or some other program, we can't just assume that, oh, these GLPs are just naturally causing muscle mass loss. So you can kind of read through that. What I will say is the GLPs are obviously a titratable medication. And what I do agree with is that, because I think GLPs can be really helpful for maintaining quality muscle mass. But when the GLP dose goes at a really high level, that actually can be more catabolic versus, a lower level, more metabolically healthy, anabolic phase of the GLPs. So again, just some more information on how GLPs do affect muscle mass. We use GLPs all the time in my practice, and these are the things that we rely on in the research that we've done, that they do improve insulin sensitivity and glucose utilization. They enhance protein synthesis and muscle growth. And there's an association with myostatin and muscle mass. So myostatin is a protein that actually inhibits muscle growth, but now studies are showing that these GLPs reduce this myostatin activity, which is really great because it can help maintain that muscle mass even as you age and you're not, doing resistance training and things like that. So there absolutely is benefit to it, but it really is about looking at the full picture and looking at all of the other things that go with it. I kind of went and kind of repeated this in my last two slides, so I won't go into detail. You can go back to that. All right, so summary and strategies to incorporate are obviously foundational biomarkers that you can assess in your practice. So like Karen said, getting an insulin, obviously blood sugars are super duper important. At the end of the day, every patient that starts a program with us, they all ask the same question: how am I going to maintain after I finish a program? And my answer is always the same. It depends on your metabolic health. And again, the metabolic health is, what are your insulin levels? How are your blood sugars? What does your muscle mass look like? And how much visceral fat do you have? That's gonna drive your vulnerabilities to maintain, any type of weight loss afterwards. So I know not everybody can get the body composition, but I do truly believe like if you're helping someone lose weight and you don't know what they're losing, I don't know. I mean, it's so easy for people nowadays to lose muscle because they're just eating so much less and they have visceral fat and it's kind of a disaster. So there are many options out there, even if it's a home scale. There's ways to kind of just get a picture of what is going on. Checking insulin levels, not just relying on blood sugars. And just remember that metabolic dysfunction is a carbohydrate intolerance. It is a dysregulation of sugar, our inability to regulate sugar in the body. So, unfortunately, for a period of time, the patients have to be on lower carbs. If we are giving and advising that patients eat small amounts of carbs all day long, well, that's keeping them in that dysfunctional state. And it's just the way it is. Their body doesn't process sugar, so if we keep giving them it, it's going to be really difficult to reverse. We have developed strategic weight loss programs that target metabolic health and visceral fat, and I'll go into a little bit into that if anybody wants to learn more about it. Those are really great programs too. So just to give you, these are a couple slides that are going to review some additional learning opportunities if you're interested. Erica and I created a GLP dietitian course. It is on demand, complete at your own pace. It's basically functional weight loss. You can kind of see the different things we talk about. It's approved for 10.75 credits. If you're interested, we have a sale going on for like one more week. So that's available. It really is an awesome course if you really are interested in functional weight loss and want to learn more about the GLPs, your patients on GLPs. So you can click there. Like I mentioned, we have strategic weight loss. These are proven metabolic health programs. We've helped so many patients. They're turnkey. And we've created the entire platform, which, handouts and everything. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can either watch the video or you can schedule a one-on-one. And if you want to learn more about CGMs, incorporating CGMs in your practice, Karen has a couple different resources here that might help get you started in that as well, and also a Facebook group if you're looking to just learn a little bit more. So that's it. Do we have, oh my gosh, I felt like that was maybe a little long-winded and a lot of talking, but does anyone have any questions?
I don't see any questions so far. If anybody wants to add them in the chat, please go ahead. Karen, I just want to say I love listening to you. Cheri and I talk all the time, so we talk about fat and muscle and all this stuff, but just all the little tidbits. I feel like I know a lot about blood sugar and insulin and CGMs, but every time you talk, I learn something new. So thank you for being here and making all of us a little bit smarter and helping our patients more.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
It goes both ways. I enjoyed this talk that you guys gave too.
I think we overwhelmed everybody with so much information. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm curious if other people are making use. I really like being able the accessibility of these in-bodies that and being able to just look up in-body near me. I'm curious if any of the other people, I know I said like 36 people are on here. Do you have in-bodies in your offices, or are you successful getting people to go and find them nearby?
Erica, I don't know if you see there's people raising their hand. I don't know
Yeah.
if that function is working.
I'm going to allow them to talk. I think that's what I have to do in order for them. I've used that I have a lot of virtual patients, so they have all been able to very closely find an in-body and share that data. So I definitely think that's a tool worth exploring.
Sorry, our chat is disabled.
Oh.
That could be why nobody's chatting. Do you
Oh.
I'm sorry about that. Do you have a question, or what? If you raise your hand, we'll unmute you.
Okay. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I have a question. What is the range of insulin? Karen said 5. Can you tell me what the actual range is? 5 to what? Do you
That's a
follow?
great question. I've seen like
What's the healthy one? You said 5 and then what?
I've seen like 4 to 7 as an optimal range. I've seen other people say try to keep it under 10. You guys have any input on that?
Yeah,
5?
Oh, go ahead. You go first.
I've continuously heard 7 or less is optimal.
And I've been trained 2 to 8.
And the other question I have, if I may, yes, we can get our own labs from FullScript, which I've ordered before, but in order to, and maybe this is, as you said, a fool's errand, how are we going to get these doctors to understand? I don't think personally they even understand the importance of getting an insulin. I asked my doctor, who's somewhat conventional, but he's like, "Oh, you don't need that. You have insulin resistance." I go, "I know that." But you follow where I'm coming from? How do we enlighten these people?
Yeah, Karen, do you want to comment? I know this is the frustrating part, and obviously, Karen, you can talk about the labs that you can go and just have the labs done. But the conventional system, I even, just again it's difficult because this is not how they're trained, and they don't, again, there's no medication to help the patient with the insulin if they see that it's elevated, right? But I think just when getting labs, I mean, there's so many ways that we can get labs on our own now.
Yeah. And Gina, I think, yeah, it's a really good question. It's like it's sort of like I wouldn't share my blood sugar levels with my dentist because that doesn't fall under my dentist to be like, why are you sharing blood sugar levels with me? That's not what I help you with. And so while I will often share lab values with my patient's doctor to say, I'm working with your patients, blah, 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 to improve this. I've seen their insulin levels, fasting insulin gradually go down. So I think we're improving insulin sensitivity. So just to give them an update, I never expect a doctor to do anything. I might update them, but to me, that insulin is just a way of helping a patient track. And that's just between me and my patient. I
Okay.
don't expect a doctor to jump on board. They're not going to do anything. That's not part of their world.
Okay, that's good to know. I mean, and you know my story, so anyway, the Mounjaro is working really good. Okay, thank you.
I have a question about, there was mention of a low carb diet for metabolic dysfunction, no exceptions. So how low, like, are we talking about, like by percentage or grams or both? And if a patient is without question eating carb all day long, how do you find it helpful to work with them to gradually reduce their carb intake, or because cold turkey is difficult sometimes in any aspect of life?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk first and then you guys can add to it if you want. But um, the amount is very different for every person. Someone can be, and I'm not saying that people have to go into ketosis or anything like that. Definitely the quality of the carbs is going to be super important. Eating whole foods is going to be such a game changer in itself. But so it's difficult to say like the amount. I mean, typically what we will do is we'll start somebody, if they're kind of a carb eater, we'll start them on maybe like 30% of their diet is carbohydrates, and then you have 35 of fat and protein. And then you kind of start to play with that depending on the person, and kind of like how they're responding to that. Another thing that we find to be really helpful is just getting people to stop eating all day long, right? Maybe you do some intermittent fasting, or maybe you tell someone, all right, if you're going to do carbs, pick one meal, and the other two, you're just eating protein, fats, vegetables, and that type of thing. So they can go a longer period of time without the carbohydrates. So those are maybe just some things to think about.
I agree with everything Cheri said. A couple other things when people really enjoy their carbs would be get movement after a meal that's higher carbohydrate. That'll improve the insulin sensitivity. I do really like narrowing the window of eating or just focusing on one meal. How Karen showed you, every time you're having some carbohydrate, there's the insulin follows, and that's the problem. So even teaching our patients that, so when they understand, I feel like that helps a lot more as well. You're on mute.
I want to chime in because this is something I run into, and it's a nuance. I have a lot of people who will ask me, do you work with people who are vegetarian, who are plant-based? Because I feel like all of my protein sources are very high in starch as well. And so, and I want to bring this up because you will find that when you get patients who are vegetarian or 100% plant-based, and you feel like, God, they're going to be eating more carbohydrates. I'm thinking of one particular patient, but I work with a lot of people who were raised in South Asia and now work in our area. And so they have a traditional South Asian Indian diet, and they're vegetarian. And one patient I have in particular, really bad insulin resistance. She had an A1C of about 11.5, and she had started improving it before she came to see me. But vegetarian, she uses a lot of dairy for her protein and pulses, but she can't have eggs. She just reacts badly. So no eggs, dairy and pulses, and some rice. So she backed off on carbohydrates, but there's a balance between starches and especially saturated fat in meals, where if you have both a high starch and a high saturated fat, it's like an insulin resistant recipe.
Mm-hmm.
And so she found, because she was going to be eating a higher starch meal, she had to be more moderate, and she hates exercise. So this is someone who was not exercising and made improvements, that she actually needed to back, well, my energy is coming from carbohydrates. She actually needed to back off on a lot of the saturated fat to allow for some of that. And we improved her insulin sensitivity. So sometimes you have to do some workarounds. It doesn't have to be, you have to work with people
Right.
in their diet preferences, and it can be done. And so many people will actually say plant-based diets fix diabetes. And I think that's proof enough that you can still eat beating starches, but it's like Cheri was saying, it's the quality of those carbohydrates. And I always like to say, you can have it all, you just can't have it all at the same time.
Anyone else?
There were a couple other people that raised their hand, but I'm not sure if they wanted to